Ladies and gentlemen, today we embark on a conversation that speaks not just to the intellect, but to the very heart of our being. The subject before us is both profound and simple, for it pertains to the question we all must face: what does it mean to grow? And not just in the external, fleeting sense of achievement, but in the deep, unchanging nature of our souls. It is an old wisdom, but one that bears repeating. Know thyself. We are all so often caught up in the busyness of the world around us that we fail to turn inward and reflect. Yet it is through self-reflection that we begin to uncover the truths about who we are, the contradictions we hold, the desires that lead us astray, and the gifts that lie dormant. It is only by truly facing these aspects of ourselves that we begin the path toward becoming something more than we were yesterday. This awareness is not passive, it is a form of courage that requires us to look at our flaws, our strengths, and the landscape of our inner world. In doing so, we learn how we may begin to grow, not in a superficial sense, but in the profound manner that changes the very fabric of our lives. But to truly grow, self-awareness must be accompanied by discipline. Growth in the spiritual realm is not an accident, nor is it a gift granted only to the fortunate few. It requires effort, dedication, and practice. We live in a world that prizes immediate results, but spiritual growth is akin to the tending of a garden. The soil of our character must be carefully cultivated, and this requires the virtues of patience, humility, and perseverance. Without these, we risk growing only in the wrong direction, much like a tree that bends toward the light without developing a deep root system. The virtues we nurture within ourselves, honesty, kindness, self-control, are the waters and sunlight that make true growth possible. These virtues do not come easily. They must be learned through deliberate action and self-discipline. Yet when we begin to embody these qualities, we see transformation occur not only within ourselves, but in the world around us. It is tempting, in moments of spiritual contemplation, to think of the material world as something that hinders our growth. However, the true challenge lies not in renouncing the world around us, but in learning to live in it with wisdom. Spiritual growth does not call us to escape the world, it calls us to enter it with a heart full of compassion, a mind rooted in clarity, and an understanding that our actions ripple through the lives of others. It is in the material world that our spiritual practices must be tested, for it is there that we are faced with real struggles, real temptations, and the need for real growth. The spiritual journey is not an inward retreat, but a fuller, deeper engagement with the world. By living with intentionality, we learn to navigate life's challenges with grace, finding meaning in the simplest tasks and fulfillment in the quiet moments of life. The journey of spiritual growth begins with self-knowledge, a concept that, though ancient, remains essential to this very day. To truly grow, we must first understand who we are at our deepest core. This requires more than a casual glance at our external behavior or a brief reflection on our thoughts. It calls for an honest, unflinching exploration of our inner landscape, our motivations, our fears, our desires, and the values that guide us. The importance of self-knowledge lies in the fact that without it, any attempt at growth is akin to building a house on shaky foundations. We must first be aware of what we are and where we stand before we can envision what we might become. Self-knowledge begins with an awareness of our limitations. It is not enough to simply recognize what we do well, we must also identify the areas where we struggle. In our modern world, it is easy to focus on our strengths, to celebrate the things we excel at, and to overlook the places where we fall short. However, true self-awareness involves embracing both our virtues and our flaws. It requires humility to admit that we are not perfect, and it demands the courage to face our shortcomings without self-deception. This doesn't mean wallowing in self-pity or being overly harsh on ourselves, but rather understanding that growth is a process and acknowledging the areas that need attention. Without this honest confrontation with our own limitations, any attempt to change or improve will be superficial at best. Acknowledging our flaws is the first step toward change because it enables us to begin addressing them consciously rather than letting them govern our lives unchecked. Equally important is the recognition of our desires. We all have inner longings, some noble, others less so, that influence our actions and choices. Many of these desires arise from external sources, society's expectations, cultural norms, or the influences of those around us. But self-knowledge demands that we become aware of these desires and their origins. Are we driven by the pursuit of status or wealth? Do we seek approval from others to validate our worth? Or is our desire rooted in something deeper, something more meaningful, such as a quest for truth or the development of compassion? By understanding the nature of our desires, we can better direct them toward constructive and meaningful ends. Self-knowledge, then, is not simply about recognizing what we want, but about understanding why we want it. This understanding enables us to choose our paths with intention and clarity, rather than being carried along by fleeting impulses or external pressures. Self-knowledge also requires an awareness of our inner conflicts, the parts of us that are in opposition. We are complex beings, and often the conflicting aspects of our personality can undermine our spiritual growth. For instance, one part of us may desire peace and tranquility, while another part may be driven by ambition and competition. These contradictions are not unusual, but they must be recognized if we are to grow. By becoming aware of these internal battles, we can begin to integrate the various facets of our personality rather than allowing them to pull us in opposing directions. This process of integration involves aligning our actions with our higher values and striving for harmony within ourselves. When we are aware of these internal tensions, we can make conscious choices that support our growth rather than inadvertently reinforcing our inner conflicts. The role of self-knowledge is not limited to identifying our flaws and desires. It also encompasses recognizing our strengths and potential. Just as we must acknowledge our weaknesses, we must also be aware of our capacities for greatness. Every person has unique gifts, whether they are intellectual, emotional, or creative, that, when properly recognized and cultivated, can lead to profound growth. However, these strengths can remain dormant if we are not mindful of them. For instance, someone with a deep capacity for empathy may not realize the extent of their ability to connect with others unless they consciously develop and express this trait. Self-knowledge helps us identify these strengths and challenges us to use them not for personal gain, but to contribute positively to the world around us. Recognizing our potential is a vital aspect of spiritual growth, as it motivates us to strive toward the fullest version of ourselves. Self-knowledge is an ongoing process. It is not a one-time realization, but a continuous unfolding of understanding. As we grow and change, so too does our understanding of who we are. Our experiences, relationships, and the challenges we face in life provide new opportunities for self-discovery. What we understand about ourselves today may be only a partial view, and as we develop further, we may come to see ourselves in a new light. This constant process of learning about ourselves helps us remain humble, grounded, and open to transformation. Without such ongoing self-reflection, we risk stagnation, as we may become complacent with our current understanding of who we are, rather than seeking the deeper wisdom that comes with new insights. Spiritual growth is not merely a passive state, but a dynamic process that requires active effort and conscious discipline. It is easy to assume that growth happens on its own, that by merely existing or wishing for change, we will somehow evolve into better versions of ourselves. However, this is far from the truth. Genuine transformation in the spiritual realm, like any meaningful development, demands intentionality, effort, and commitment. The practice of discipline is essential because, without it, spiritual growth risks becoming superficial or even stagnant. The most fundamental aspect of discipline in the context of spiritual growth is consistency. It is not enough to have a fleeting desire for improvement, rather, true growth arises from habitual actions that align with our higher values and goals. These actions must be repeated, even when we don't feel motivated or inspired, for it is through repetition that virtues and wisdom are cultivated. For instance, one may have the intention of becoming more patient, but this intention alone is insufficient without actively practicing patience in everyday situations. Each time we find ourselves frustrated, we are presented with an opportunity to exercise patience, whether it's in traffic, with a difficult person, or in moments of personal discomfort. The key is to remain disciplined in our commitment to these practices, no matter how trivial or insignificant they may seem. Over time, these small acts build upon one another, gradually transforming our character. It is not the occasional act of patience, but the consistent, repeated choice to act patiently that nurtures this virtue within us. This brings us to the concept of delayed gratification, which is central to the idea of spiritual discipline. In a world that celebrates instant gratification, where we can quickly satisfy almost any desire at the touch of a button, it can be challenging to cultivate the virtue of patience and the ability to wait. Yet, delayed gratification is an essential part of spiritual maturity. Whether it's resisting the temptation to indulge in a fleeting pleasure or refraining from reacting impulsively in a stressful situation, the ability to pause and reflect before acting is a key marker of spiritual discipline. This form of self-control is not about suppressing or denying ourselves, but about recognizing that the path to deeper fulfillment often requires waiting, reflecting, and choosing wisely. Delayed gratification teaches us to align our actions with our long-term goals rather than our immediate desires. It is through this practice that we learn to live with greater intention and awareness, rather than being swept away by the distractions of the moment. Another crucial aspect of discipline in spiritual growth is the cultivation of virtues such as humility, kindness, and compassion. These virtues do not come naturally or easily to most people. They require consistent effort and conscious attention. Humility, for example, involves recognizing that we are not the center of the universe and that others have just as much value and worth as we do. It requires the discipline to let go of ego-driven desires and the need to prove ourselves. Practicing humility means putting others first, listening attentively, and resisting the urge to dominate conversations or situations. It also requires us to acknowledge our mistakes, learn from them, and grow. Kindness and compassion, similarly, are not automatic responses but require active effort. In a world that often values competition and self-interest, practicing kindness can feel counterintuitive. However, the discipline of showing kindness to others, whether through small acts of service or simply offering a word of encouragement, gradually transforms our hearts and minds. This is why spiritual discipline is often described as training. It is akin to honing a skill or perfecting an art. Like a musician who practices daily, or an athlete who trains regularly, we must consistently practice virtues until they become second nature. Discipline also involves the cultivation of self-control in the face of temptation. In our spiritual journey, we are constantly confronted with desires that pull us away from our higher goals, whether it is the temptation to indulge in materialism, to gossip about others, or to succumb to anger. Self-control is the ability to recognize these temptations and choose not to act on them. This is not always easy, as the pull of our immediate desires can be strong. However, it is through resisting these temptations that we grow spiritually. The more we exercise self-control, the more we strengthen our inner resolve, allowing us to make wiser choices in the future. The practice of self-control is not a denial of our humanity, but an affirmation of our ability to choose and direct our actions toward higher purposes. Over time, this self-discipline enables us to live more harmoniously with our values, rather than being controlled by fleeting emotions or external pressures. Discipline is essential in creating space for the deeper practices of spiritual growth, such as meditation, prayer, or study. These practices require time, attention, and commitment. In the midst of our busy lives, it can be easy to neglect these vital practices, assuming that we can find time for them when we are less busy or when we feel more inspired. However, the truth is that without discipline, these practices will not become regular parts of our lives. It is the disciplined commitment to setting aside time each day, whether for prayer, meditation, reading, or reflection, that deepens our spiritual understanding and connects us to a higher source. This is where the true work of spiritual growth happens. These practices help us align ourselves with our higher purpose, cultivate a sense of inner peace, and develop the wisdom necessary to navigate the challenges of life. Discipline in spiritual growth is not about rigid control or self-punishment. It is about developing the freedom to choose actions that are aligned with our deepest values and long-term goals. It is about developing the ability to resist the distractions and temptations that lead us away from our true selves. Through consistent effort, we can refine our character, nurture our virtues, and ultimately become the people we are meant to be. True spiritual growth does not call for a retreat from the world, but rather it challenges us to engage with it more profoundly. The relationship between the spiritual and the material is often misunderstood. Many perceive spirituality as something that must be isolated from the everyday concerns of life. However, spiritual growth is not about withdrawing from the world or renouncing its material aspects. Instead, it is about learning to navigate the material world with greater wisdom, clarity, and compassion. The essence of spiritual growth lies in how we approach and engage with the world around us, not in rejecting it, but in transforming the way we interact with it. The first aspect of this relationship is recognizing that the material world is not inherently opposed to spiritual growth. In fact, the material world is the very arena in which our spiritual practices are tested and refined. It is easy to have lofty ideals and grand spiritual thoughts when isolated from the everyday challenges of life. It is in the midst of the mundane, when dealing with difficult people, navigating complex situations, or facing personal hardship, that the true measure of our spiritual progress becomes clear. A person may profess virtues like patience, kindness, or forgiveness, but it is only when they are faced with situations that challenge these virtues that they are given the opportunity to practice them. The material world, in all its complexity, provides us with these opportunities daily. Therefore, spiritual growth is not about distancing oneself from life's challenges, but about learning to meet those challenges with a spirit of grace, awareness, and compassion. Spirituality does not require us to abandon our responsibilities or desires for a fulfilling life in the material world. We live in a society that often equates success with material wealth, status, or outward achievement. Spiritual growth, however, calls us to examine our relationship with these pursuits and to question whether they truly bring lasting happiness. It is not that material success or comfort is inherently bad, but when these pursuits become the driving force of our lives, they can easily divert us from our spiritual path. Spiritual growth teaches us to seek a deeper purpose beyond material accomplishments, to recognize that true fulfillment is not found in possessions or accolades, but in the cultivation of virtues such as contentment, compassion, and wisdom. In this way, the material world becomes a tool for spiritual development rather than a distraction from it. The key is balance to participate in the material world without becoming consumed by it. In practical terms, this means that spiritual growth calls us to live intentionally in the material world. It is about choosing how we engage with our work, relationships, and daily tasks. Each aspect of our lives, whether it is our profession, our interactions with others, or the way we take care of our physical bodies, presents an opportunity for spiritual practice. For example, in our work, we can practice integrity, diligence, and service to others rather than focusing solely on personal gain or advancement. In our relationships, we can cultivate kindness, empathy, and patience, seeing others not as obstacles or means to an end, but as fellow travelers on the path of life. Even in the most mundane tasks, cooking, cleaning, driving, there is the potential to engage with mindfulness and presence, bringing an awareness to the way we approach the world around us. Spirituality, in this sense, is not a separate compartment of our lives, but something that infuses and transforms every action we take, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem. Another important aspect of the relationship between the spiritual and the material is the cultivation of generosity. Spiritual growth challenges us to shift our focus from accumulation to contribution, from selfishness to selflessness. In a materialistic society, where the accumulation of wealth and possessions is often seen as the ultimate goal, generosity becomes a powerful antidote. Generosity is not just about giving money or material goods, it is about offering our time, our attention, and our care to others. It is about recognizing that our lives are interconnected, and that true abundance is found not in hoarding resources, but in sharing them. This is not to suggest that we should abandon all material possessions, but rather that we should not become attached to them or let them define our worth. When we shift our focus from acquiring to giving, we begin to align ourselves with a deeper spiritual truth that happiness and fulfillment are not found in what we have, but in what we give. The spiritual path invites us to develop a new perspective on suffering. In the material world, suffering is often viewed as something to be avoided at all costs. Yet the spiritual perspective teaches us that suffering, though painful, is also a teacher. It is through the challenges and hardships of life that we often grow the most. When we experience loss, disappointment, or failure, we are given an opportunity to examine our attachments, our fears, and our desires. Suffering helps to reveal the areas of our lives where we may be out of alignment with our true purpose, and it invites us to reconsider our priorities. This does not mean that we should seek suffering for its own sake, but rather that we should not fear it or resist it when it comes. Instead, we are called to face suffering with resilience and grace, understanding that it is an inevitable part of life and a catalyst for growth. To personal suffering, we are also called to respond to the suffering of others. Spiritual growth is deeply connected to our ability to empathize with the pain of others and to act with compassion. The material world can often be a harsh place, filled with injustice, inequality, and suffering. While we cannot change the entire world, we can choose to act with kindness and empathy in our immediate surroundings. This may involve offering support to a friend in need, standing up for someone who is marginalized, or simply offering a kind word to someone who is struggling. The spiritual path calls us to expand our circle of concern, to move beyond our own immediate interests, and to recognize the interconnectedness of all people. In this way, the material world becomes a place where our spiritual values are put into action, where our inner growth manifests in tangible acts of service and compassion.